As you all know that small and medium-sized enterprises contribute a lot to the economy. And if I quickly give, a bit generic statistics, 90% of the total world enterprise is SMEs. Okay, and they contribute 50 to 60% to GDP. Irrespective of whether they are in developing or emerging or developed economy. So contribution is quite a bit. In the UK, in 2021, there are 5.6 million SMEs, which has gone a bit down from 6 million in 2020. Okay, so it's a quite a bit of number and employ 16 million people. And if we look into worldwide, 50% of the employment, more than 50% of the employment is contributed by SME. Okay. But their environmental performance is not really great. 70% of the pollution is being created by SMEs. 50% of the pollution incidents are being contributed by SMEs in Asia Pacific region. And in the UK, 8 out of 10 pollution incident is contributed by small and medium-sized enterprises. And particularly in manufacturing sector, 64% of the pollution is contributed by small and medium-sized enterprises. But scary bit is only 0.4% of the companies have proper environmental management systems. So there are loads to really do. So our small and medium-sized enterprises, low carbon SMEs project is contributing to address that issue by helping the companies within, Midlands, West Midland mainly, in 2 lab areas, in the GBS lab, the Greater Birmingham and Solihull, as well as the Black Country. We are helping the companies to reduce their carbon footprint. Okay, that's the project we are talking about today. So this project started in 2017 and will continue till February 2023. So we have 1 more year to really go. And our target is to really help 165 companies. And we have already done more than 100 companies. So we are trying to really recruit more companies to work with us. Our major target is to reduce carbon footprint by in an average of 7 ton per company for one intervention. I will give you a quick perspective of what 7 ton of carbon footprint reduction means. It's around, taking 5 cars off from the road, or just planting 30 trees, that sort of things. But we could really achieve in an average 40 ton per company, which is quite substantial. But alongside, we have seen that through carbon footprint reduction, we could really help companies to improve their business performance as well as well-being, employee well-being. We could enhance that. So that's the story we would be telling fast, as well as giving some perspective of the case studies. And way forward, and how could we really recruit more companies, and how could we really help the companies more to achieve lowering the carbon footprint. Additionally, I will tell that we do loads of webinar as well as face-to-face workshop. Pre-pandemic state, we did more than, I think, 15 workshops where we could really disseminate our research finding. Predominantly, as you can see, that we have 4 people working directly in the project, but there are other 20 academics, both from engineering as well as School of Management. We work together to make it happen. So we are directly helping companies by visiting them and going beyond, not only just fulfilling the targets given by our funder, but also trying to really help them in lowering their carbon footprint. I will now hand over to my colleague to really continue and give specific information about the project, covering process we adopt, pros and cons, and the doable from our side, as well as commitment from the companies. So over to you, Jamal or Mark, who takes over first?
Yeah, so I'll
Okay. Yeah,
cover
please.
the first part. Great. So yeah, thank you for the introduction, Prasanta. So just following on from that, I'll give a quick overview of sort of the eligibility criteria, as well as some of our project output highlights. So, as Prasanta mentioned, our key objective is to support businesses to reduce their carbon footprint. And as we are a European funded program, we're restricted to supporting only SMEs. So an SME is a small and medium-sized enterprise. The sort of crude definition set by the European Commission is a business is an SME if they employ fewer than 250 staff. Their turnover is below 50 million euros, and they haven't exceeded their state aid allowance, which is usually set at 200,000 euros over a over a 3-year rolling period. That isn't the sort of the entire criteria, and there are a few caveats to that. But if you're unsure, please just get in touch with our program, and we can do the eligibility checks. So, are you eligible in terms of being in the right place? So, if your business is situated in Greater Birmingham, Solihull, or the Black Country, you'll qualify. So we do have a postcode checker if you're unsure whether you fall within that geographical area, so we can do the checks for you. In terms of our project outputs, we're contracted to support 165 businesses, but that's the sort of the minimum requirement. So there's a lot of demand for this type of support, so we can support more businesses. Our carbon reduction target for the 2 geographical areas is 1,270 tons. So that's what we hope to achieve by supporting businesses through different mediums. And we have £600,000 of EU grant funding to disperse towards energy efficiency measures. So this sort of encapsulates what the webinar is about. So we have quite a bit of grant funding to give out to businesses, which is always helpful. So in terms of our services, we offer a free 2 to 5 day diagnostic. So what that essentially entails is a site energy efficiency survey where we look at sort of lighting, heating, ventilation, as well as sort of process equipment, anything that uses sort of energy within the facility, and we try and identify measures to sort of reduce energy consumption, energy costs, and importantly, improve overall productivity through our interventions. Grants, available to SMEs. There's some eligibility requirements. We mainly look at the volume of carbon savings and the cost of the measure. So those 2 variables are quite important in deciphering whether a project is viable for us to fund. As Prasanta mentioned, our project runs up until February 2023. So there's no guarantee that grant funding will be available up until then. So we advise SMEs to apply sooner rather than later to avoid any disappointment. And our support is free at the point of delivery. You'll just accrue state aid, so you'll eat into your state aid allowance. Eligibility, which I've already covered. The other additional point of note is the sort of B2B criteria. So usually we're restricted to supporting businesses that have an element of sort of B2B trade. In terms of the sort of customer journey in a nutshell, we start off by signing up a business. So that's a very quick process. It's a simple digital form which can be filled in. We'll do the eligibility checks. If you're eligible, we'll enroll you onto the program, and then we'll kickstart the support immediately. We request 12 months worth of energy bills to do your carbon footprinting baseline. We then arrange a convenient time to conduct a site visit to identify recommendations, and then on the back of that we provide a carbon action report which details implementable measures, and from that businesses have the opportunity to apply for a grant. So if you're based in the Greater Birmingham Solihull region, we have grants up to the value of £6,000, which is 50% match funded. So for every pound we put in, the company tops it up by the same amount. And we only cover sort of capital equipment type interventions, for example, sort of air compressors or energy efficient heating systems, that sort of thing. There's also an opportunity to engage with our academics. Again, this is free support. If you have a specific business need that needs to be addressed, we can match sort of academic skills and expertise to help resolve those. And as Prasanta mentioned, we run workshops, webinars themed around various sort of low carbon topics. Examples here: energy management, resource efficiency, etc. So our overall objective is to reduce the carbon footprint, and as we all know, energy costs are rising, and that's putting added pressure on the company's bottom line. So we try and really sort of recommend and provide support that it improves sort of business performance. That's our sort of ultimate goal through the sort of low carbon interventions. In terms of the grant application process, it's very simple and straightforward. Usually the business completes the diagnostic, which can be done essentially within a week, subject to the company's availability. If the business has a project in mind, we'll provide a grant application form, which will help complete. It's not too taxing at all. And the main thing is, as we are funded by the European Union, we have to follow procurement rules. So rule of thumb is we'll need 3 quotes as standard, and if your project cost exceeds 25,000, there is a tender process, but we manage that all in-house for the applicant. That removes sort of any burden. So yeah, it's a quick process. Once the applicant's filled in the grant application form, we submit the application to our grants panel. They usually take up to 5 working days to provide to make a decision. And once the decision has been made, we'll issue the offer letter almost immediately. Usually it's the next day, and once the company signs the dotted line, agrees to the contract, then the project can go ahead and they can make payments to the supplier, implement the works, etc. So once the project has been completed, we just request evidence of payment through sort of certified bank statements, invoices, etc. So once we receive that, we then pay out the grant within 5 to 10 working days. So it's a very streamlined, quick process, and if a business wants to move quickly with a project, we can so complete the funding cycle within a month, really. So yeah, it's very quick. So that's our grant application and payment process in a nutshell. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, so if there's anything we haven't covered, please feel free to ask questions. And on that note, I will pass you on to Mark to cover the next section, if that's okay. Mark, if you're okay to step in.
Indeed, yes. Thank you very much, Jamal, for the background. Hope that provides enough context for what we do and how we operate, and also how the grant process works. And I'll pick up on 1 or 2 points that Jamal alluded to in my part of the talk. But essentially, the project is very good at doing certain things. There are some things it's not quite so good at, and I suggest we cover those later on. But for example, one of the key criteria is that it's primarily aimed at business to business. And the original intention of the programme was primarily to do with engineering companies, which are seen as the major emitters. So there's a sort of an expediency here where the most emissions are associated with energy intensive industries, and those are the ones that we have tended to concentrate on. And you can see the illustrations there, that the kind of businesses that we tend to look at. And small businesses, not all are engaged in manufacturing. There's an awful lot of logistics, so people doing warehousing and that kind of thing. And just as an example here, there's a picture of a compressor there, and they're very energy intensive pieces of kit. And if the compressor is more than, say, 10 years old, and there's a lot of this stuff around, it's going to be very inefficient. The controls are probably going to be rubbish as well, so these things tend to eat a lot of energy. So replacing and upgrading equipment is one of the easiest and quickest things that businesses can do, particularly if it's part of, say, a maintenance or an upgrade program. So those are the kind of things that it's very good at. And in terms of things like warehousing, space heating and lighting, they also tend to dominate in terms of energy use. So we tend to find that virtually every business we go and talk to would like a new lighting system because of old fluorescent tubes. We know they're very energy intensive. And if one blows, then it's a very expensive process to get a cherry picker in to replace it and so on. And LED lighting can save somewhere in the region of 75% to 75% of lighting energy. And if you've got a warehouse with several hundred tubes, then that's an awful lot of money that you're spending on lighting. You'd also find that the quality of light, if you switch from fluorescent tubes to LEDs, also improves. So actually you need less lighting as well. So there are synergies involved in making a lot of these changes. We also look at things like renewable energy, but it has to be said that from an energy management perspective, it's far better to do what you might call the low-hanging fruit and introduce better controls and monitoring and so forth before you start looking at making changes to your energy supply. Having said that, for some businesses, it does make an awful lot of sense. For example, we do see businesses which are expanding. They don't want to move premises, and to increase the power from the local substation can be an incredibly expensive and laborious process. So actually reducing energy demand on the grid by installing renewable energy systems, biomass, photovoltaics, all sorts of things, then actually you certainly do decouple yourself to a certain extent, but also gives you a guarantee of supply. And as we know at the moment, with the energy spikes and so on and continued uncertainty in energy markets, that gives you the business a certain degree of resilience, and you could even argue future proofing because you're actually adding value to the property. So those are the kind of things that we tend to look at, and I shall gloss over at the moment exactly what we don't cover. I suggest we cover that in the Q&A session afterwards. A good example of something that the project isn't particularly aimed at is if a business is actually moving premises. Because as Jamal mentioned, one of the things we need to do is to establish a baseline. So that needs a year's worth of your energy data. So clearly, if you're in the process of moving from one premise to another, we're going to be comparing apples and pears, which isn't viable within the constraints of the project. That's one of the little quirks, which is actually quite difficult to deal with on project terms. So I think what we'll do is we'll talk a bit about the kind of projects that we are good at covering. So Jamal, could you switch to the next slide? Thanks. Okay. One of the things that Jamal mentioned in the grant application process is that it's actually quite straightforward. It's all done online. The grant form itself is really quite short, but essentially the data that we're looking at is going to be based on your baseline data. So you'll submit a year's worth of data, and that will give us what we call a scope 1 emissions profile. So it's actually the stuff that you tend to use within the confines of your business. It actually excludes, although we can include, looking upstream and downstream, what are called Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. And it's probably true to a certain extent that about 80% of total emissions of any business, large or small, is actually in the supply chain. It's actually beyond the four walls. So that adds another layer of complexity to the whole process. But one of the things that we do need to do is we need to look at your energy data and say, okay, this is your current carbon footprint and your energy costs as well. And if you're going to make any kind of changes, whether it's lighting, compressors and so forth, then you need to be able to quantify that in a project profile. So typically, if we're looking for project information, it is essentially, what are you going to do? What's it going to cost? What are you going to save? And how are you going to evidence that? And for example, with things like lighting projects, there's been quite a history of dealing with people who are registered for projects with, for example, the Carbon Trust. So if a business supplier is already Carbon Trust registered, they will have to provide that kind of evidence. They'll say this is what kind of energy consumption is already, the existing energy lighting system uses. If we replace all of that with an LED system, this is what we'd expect the energy saving to be in terms of not only financial saving, but also the carbon. So they do some of the homework for us. And that's the kind of data that the panel wants to see. So that what we want to do is to look at, is a project going to be within a ceiling? So there's a cost benefit analysis that goes on as part of the calculation. So there are some projects which are eminently fundable, and LED is clearly one of those, is one of the cheapest ways of reducing energy costs. But there are other projects as well. I also mentioned things like compressors and so on. So other energy intensive pieces of equipment, which are fairly modest budget, we're quite happy to support. There are some things which aren't so good at doing. One of the key things is we also can't provide retrospective funding for fairly obvious reasons. So whatever happens if you apply for a grant, don't pay for any deposits or pay any money up front. Everything has to be done retrospectively. So a business will have to pay out the money and then recover it from the grant afterwards. And the level of project funding is 50%, as I think Jamal mentioned as well. The other key criteria is, as I mentioned earlier, it is primarily business to business, so we don't do high streets. And again, under European rules, retail comes under a different sets of directives and so on. Ours is mainly geared, as I said earlier, to the manufacturing sector. And the grants pay up to the 50% of the cost. And I say up to 50% because, for example, if the project costs 4K, then you're eligible for 2K towards that. And in the GBS LEP, we are slightly more generous, to the tune of £6,000 grant. So that's projects up to 12K. If it costs more than that, then it's prorated. So you'll still get the 6K, but then we're into a different territory, which may involve procurement and so forth, and very expensive projects. For example, solar photovoltaic systems, which tend to be fairly pricey commodities. Anyway, and in the Black Country, we are running out of grants. There are only a handful left, and we've had to ration that to a maximum grant of £3,000. Unfortunately, that's the situation we're with at the moment. So if you're in the Black Country and you want a grant, hurry, hurry, hurry. There isn't much left. Minimum project spend is 2K. And again, this is to do with the cost of bureaucracy and so forth. And if it's less than 2K, there is an argument which is, well, why doesn't the business just invest in it anyway, and save us all the trouble? And then the final aspect is the value of the grant is based on the per tonne of carbon saved. So one of the things that the project isn't particularly good at doing is doing big capital expenditure works on, for example, the fabric of the building. An awful lot of the buildings that we see are fairly old, fairly poor in terms of energy performance. We probably have the worst building stock in the whole of Europe. So actually to bring our building stock up to scratch is going to be very, very capital intensive. So, you know, a typical cost of insulating, for example, a warehouse could be between £100,000 or £200,000 quite easily. Clearly, our project grant doesn't even come close to saving that kind of money. And the same goes, for example, with double glazing, which is actually a very good thing to do, but from a carbon point of view isn't, because it's an incredibly expensive thing to do, and the payback is really quite long. So those very kind of capital intensive projects with fairly modest carbon returns are beyond our remit. So our project really is good at doing things like kick-starting businesses on the road to zero carbon. It actually encourages things like energy management systems, better controls and so forth, that actually gets a business to engage with the whole area of energy management in the first instance. And a lot of those savings aren't necessarily capital expenditure, they're really down to effective management. So that's a summary of really what the grant's are all about. Now we'll talk a bit about a couple of the examples, and here's one. And this is a company that manufactures toffee apples, and very good they are too, I might add. And they came to us and they said, well, we've been going for a few years. Our energy costs are really starting to soar. What on earth can we do about it? So there's from the project that was done, the two key areas of energy consumption were propane gas, so they're not on grid, and also electricity. So heat losses, as you can imagine, making toffee apples is a fairly energy intensive process. You've got to boil stuff and all the rest of it. And by the simple expedient of improving insulation in various cylinders and so forth, and including heat recovery via a heat exchanger to make the whole process more efficient, then your savings will rapidly accrue. And the benefits there, about 30% per year. Now, for a small business, that's quite a substantial cost reduction. The other side benefits you get, and this frequently happens in other cases, is that you make changes in one part of a system, so you improve energy efficiency. Then you also find that you get better process control. Again, it's all also aligned to energy efficiency. You get better quality products as well. So what is there not to like? And a better quality of toffee apple is going to sell better than a poor quality of toffee apple. And you want consistency of product quality. And the business owner was delighted with this, as you might imagine. Very satisfying, as he says, from a technical and environmental benefit aspects. So there are a number of winners. Allied to that as well, again, I'll come back to the illustration of lighting systems. You improve the lighting, you actually improve the quality of the workplace, so everybody benefits. There are knock-on effects, for example, in terms of health and safety. You reduce the risk of trips, hazards and so forth with better quality of lighting. It also means as well, if you want to have a quality control system, clearly in manufacturing, one of the first checks is a visual. And if you've got poor quality lighting, you don't necessarily know what's going out of the door. The chances are you're going to get returned products. So that's case study one. Jamal, can we have the next one, please? Thank you. And this is something an awful lot more ambitious. This is a company which is already engaged in electrical equipment as well. They've done an awful lot of work on their own premises, so they've improved the insulation, they've reduced the running costs as far as possible. They've got a good management system in place. They've got control technology and all the rest of that. The next thing they want to do is, okay, what do we do next? They've got a southwest facing roof and it's not overlooked, and there's a really decent sized amount of space they've got. And one estimate from an energy company suggests that given the amount of available commercial roof space in the UK, if every factory had PV systems installed, that's somewhere in the region of 50%. That's 50% of total UK electricity demand. So there's a colossal amount of roof space out there that could be used to generate our own energy. And again, in the era of energy spikes that we're seeing at the moment, energy insecurity and so on, then it's starting to look like a very good proposition. As I mentioned earlier, photovoltaic systems are not cheap, but the cost has been plummeting over the past 10, 20 years. The efficiency has really improved. The systems are so much better. There's an awful lot of integration that can be achieved. We're now also looking at cost-effective battery storage and smart controls, so you can export to the grid and import and so forth. You can also link it up with EV charging systems and all the rest of it. So all this is actually now not only technically viable, but also commercially viable as well. And this particular business, that they look at their payback on their system, and the estimates were about 5.5 years. And typically, historically, VV systems had a payback of somewhere between 10, 12, 13 odd years or so. So within 5.5 years, it's looking like a really good investment. And of course, you're insulating the business from future energy shocks and guaranteeing that you've got your own energy supply. One of the things that may happen in the future, if we get things like blackouts or even brownouts, is that domestic energy takes precedent over commercial energy. So there are penalties associated with businesses that operate, say, for example, in the early evening when everybody comes home from work and puts the kettle on, and if there isn't enough energy to go around the grid, then the businesses get penalised. So there's an incentive there to install solar PV if you're operating a business that operates 24/7. So that's something to consider. But again, this is towards the top end of the kind of projects that we'll support, but they do make an awful lot of sense, and we'd like to see more businesses engage with this. There are other issues as well, and one of the obvious ones is that in this case the business owns their own premises. So from a contractual point of view and an ownership point of view, it's a far more straightforward proposition than having to negotiate with landlords, and if you're dealing with short leases and all those kind of issues. And in fact, short leases are also a problem in dealing with other aspects of energy efficiency, roller shutter doors, all this kind of stuff. If you make changes to your premises, then that has implications from a legal perspective. That's not an area necessarily I want to talk about because it's straying off the subject. But essentially, that's a quick roundup of a few examples of the kind of projects that we supported. So Jamal, so if we can hand over now to any questions we've got that people would like to fire at us, then we'll have a go at answering them.